Hello and welcome to ESG Talk, your go-to source for insights and advice from leaders in environmental, social, and governance. I'm your host, Steve Soter, and today we're discussing forthcoming climate disclosure rules from the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. Big thanks to Mandy McReynolds for again letting me take the mic. As most of you know, in March 2022, the SEC released a proposal that would require U.S. public companies to include certain emissions and climate-related financial data in their disclosures. More recently, the SEC announced that its ruling would come in April of this year. While we'll have to wait and see if they stick to that timeline, when the ruling comes, make no mistake, this will be a watershed moment for both ESG and finance professionals. So today's episode comes in two parts. First up, I'll be talking with my colleague, Mark Mellen, about the proposal and what we predict will make it into the final ruling. Prior to coming to Workiva, Mark was a senior manager in Deloitte Sustainability and ESG Services practice. He has over 15 years of experience advising organizations on managing risk, especially as it relates to ESG. And later in the show, I'll be joined by David Kanarek, Vice President and Managing Counsel at the American Express Company. Part of David's role entails advising senior management on disclosure matters, which includes SEC reporting. Well, Mark, let's first get started. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve. Great to be here.
So, Mark, as you well know, we both follow SEC and ESG reporting requirements very closely, and recognizing that not everybody is familiar with perhaps the finer details of the SEC's climate proposal, what I'm thinking is let's start off with just a short summary of what's currently in the proposal, and then maybe you and I can predict and discuss, perhaps debate, what we think might make it into the final rule. So, first, let's start with the financial statement footnotes. So in the SEC's proposal, they're calling for disclosure of the impact on financial statement line items related to severe weather events or transition activities, provided that those events or activities exceed 1% of the related financial statement line item. So as examples, if my expenses went up due to a climate event, or if I had to invest to make my infrastructure more resilient to climate change, should these events impact my financial statement line items by more than 1%, I would need to disclose them separately, including in a separate footnote. I think what's especially notable here for our audience is that anything in the financial statements will be subject to financial statement audits, internal control over financial reporting as well. So there will be a ton of auditor scrutiny on these new proposed disclosures. So, Mark, this part of the proposal, as you know, got a ton of attention from financial reporting professionals especially. But what's your take? How much of that do you foresee makes it into the final ruling?
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. This part has definitely garnered a lot of attention in the market through the comments that the SEC received, as well as in a lot of our conversations, whether it be internally as a team or with customers and prospects in the marketplace. I think when we really look at it, the SEC may lessen the requirement here in the final rule. Obviously, I'm looking into my crystal ball, which I don't actually have, but when we think about the amount of pushback there and the potential for litigation, as we think about what happens after the SEC makes a final rule, I think the potential for the 1% threshold could be moved, potentially in line with how companies determine financial statement materiality. And even beyond that, I know we've had some conversations as well as we think about the location of these disclosures within the financial statements, and to lessen the burden on organizations and relieve a little bit of the risk that it comes along with putting disclosures into the financial statements. We might see those moved outside of the financial statements into this new section that's being proposed immediately preceding MD&A.
Yeah, I know you and I went back and forth on this one. That was my take too. I do think that the 1% goes away. That felt like that came a little bit out of left field. There certainly are bright line tests in SEC reporting. This one felt a little bit odd, so I would tend to agree that that probably looks more like how you would traditionally determine financial statement materiality, which considers both quantitative and qualitative factors. But where they end up is interesting. I wonder if you were to move that out of the financial statements, as you said, and maybe put it in that new section of the 10K, which would be meant for these climate disclosures, if that might lessen that, I would say, a fairly severe pushback from the financial reporting community on this proposal. But if you had to guess, do you think it stays in the financial statements?
Yeah, it's a good question. I know we went back and forth on that, and I'll be interested to see. I think as we think about standardization and assurance and level of confidence that the stakeholders are looking for, like investors, obviously, it's a possibility that some of those do stay in the financial statements.
Well, and I do think it's also interesting to consider the potential interplay between a final SEC climate disclosure ruling and what is going to make it in the CSRD, which is a European, of course, disclosure requirement, where those disclosures, I think, are going to be very integrated. So you could picture a company that's complying with both, where you would almost need to collect and prepare the most detailed level of data, and then maybe just the presentation of that ends up being a little bit different depending on, for example, if that's being disclosed as part of the CSRD or the SEC's climate disclosure. Um, so, Mark, let's dig in now to greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. Under the proposal, companies would be required to report their greenhouse gas emissions from their operations and purchased electricity, including Scope 1 and Scope 2, with a focus on intensity and before any offsets. Scope 3 would be disclosed if it's material or if the company had set a goal that includes Scope 3. So, Mark, of course, let me ask, how do you think this will play out in the final ruling? And do you specifically think Scope 3 will be included?
Yeah, it's a great question. And obviously, these GHG emissions disclosures are currently proposed in this new section of the 10K, which would immediately precede MD&A or the climate related disclosures section. And I estimate that these are likely going to remain in the final rule in terms of at least Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, which have become somewhat table stakes for organizations as they think about communicating how they manage climate risk within their organization in terms of the metrics and targets they look at. When we look at Scope 3, obviously there was similarly a lot of pushback as it relates to Scope 3, but I think as companies have explored this more and more, I think there's a realization that there's a lot of available estimation methods that will allow companies to measure Scope 3 emissions with some level of precision that's at least acceptable today in the market. And there is likely still going to be a requirement, I anticipate, somewhat similar to what we see in the proposed rule.
Well, I think that I tend to agree with you. The one change that I had that you and I discussed that I think you said it felt somewhat European, but I really like it. I think that Scope 3 stays in as it's proposed, but it wouldn't surprise me if maybe there was an election that a company could make to not disclose it if they were to describe why they are unable to. And, that might feel like perhaps a cop out, but I would suspect that if your peers, if you were the only one that had made that election to say, hey, well, we can't do it either because it's difficult or expensive or risky or whatever, I suspect there would be a high amount of scrutiny on that disclosure in the SEC, and investors and others might be asking, hey, everybody else in your peer group is doing it. Why can't you do it as well? I don't know. Do you do you think that might be within the SEC's appetite, Mark?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I don't know. I did make that comment in terms of somewhat European because we've seen some additional disclosure explain type requirements over in the EU, whether it be UK TCFD requirements or others. I think that's definitely a possibility. I think when in the SEC's current proposal, we see the opportunity for companies maybe to pull back targets that they've set publicly too. Although I would probably argue that if an organization has any type of operation, Scope 3 is likely material for them, regardless of what type of an industry they're operating in. It's just, so much of a portion of how they think of, or how an organization should think about their GHG footprint. So I think that's possible, but at least in terms of the disclosure explain approach, but I do still think we'll see it in there in terms of the final rule in some way.
Got it. Well, spoiler alert. This is not the only place where I think a disclose or explain approach might be applicable here. And on that note, let's move now to the attestation requirements. So this would be the review of an auditor in order to provide assurance to these disclosures. Mark, as you know, the SEC has proposed a 1-year phase-in of limited assurance for Scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions, followed by a 2-year phase-in of reasonable assurance. I'm wondering, maybe just to get started, could you, for our audience, perhaps briefly explain the difference between limited and reasonable assurance?
Yeah, happy to. As someone who used to provide limited and reasonable assurance on ESG disclosure, it's something I guess near and dear to my heart. So when we think about limited assurance, especially in the world of AICPA regulations or professional standards, that is, we're thinking about the same level of confidence that a user of that information that's being assured can have when we look at similar types of financial disclosures, like the quarterly reports that public companies file with the SEC. And when we look at reasonable assurance, that's the same level of confidence that the users of that information can have in that disclosure, similar to what we see in annual financial statements that are filed with public companies that are by public companies with the SEC. And I think what I see as the big difference there, and what you probably see if you were an ESG professional obtaining this assurance, is really the level and extent of procedures that the auditor goes through in terms of the amount of samples that are selected, the amount of substantive testing that's done to gain that level of confidence that they can provide the opinion, which comes along with reasonable assurance, as opposed to with limited assurance, it's a negative conclusion. Which, if you read through that, nothing came to our attention that would lead us to believe that something was wrong. Doesn't exude confidence the same way as, in all material respects, everything we saw was right.
Well, appreciate that explanation. And I'm wondering now, can you share your thoughts? Do you think that, as proposed, those assurance requirements stay in the final rule?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'd like to say yes, because I think there's a lot of organizations, even today, on a voluntary basis, that are obtaining limited assurance on their GHG emissions. And I think as organizations are encouraged to evolve their ESG disclosure based on stakeholder expectations in line with their financial statements, I think that's a good step, at least in that direction.
Yeah. Well, I similarly had a little bit of a hard time with this one. I am guessing that the phase in of limited assurance is actually a little bit longer, maybe 2 or 3 years instead of 1 year. And again, my comply or explain, I actually wonder if that might also be available for reasonable assurance. Um, Again, if I'm the SEC, certainly there's some fallout potential, and I wonder, could the SEC maybe loosen things up, but either due to peer pressure or pressure from investors, still get the same result? And so I think, again, if a company is disclosing that, hey, we can't get reasonable assurance and here's why, but it appears that their peer group, most everybody else can, I suspect a little bit of peer pressure as well as some perhaps review pressure from the SEC on those filings might actually get more people over to the reasonable assurance threshold. Be interesting. Um, I think this one is kind of easy, but we will talk about the qualitative disclosures. So there will be several qualitative disclosures required by companies that we suspect will make it in the SEC's final ruling. Those might include the impact of climate-related risks on financial statements, details of risk management and carbon pricing programs, as well as progress updates on climate-related targets and disclosure of any climate-related transition plans. Again, Mark, this felt like an easy one, but do you think any of this gets changed in a final rule?
Yeah, I think a lot of this will remain consistent with what's been proposed by the SEC currently. And a big part of that is all of this, for the majority of it, is aligned to the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, which has widely become accepted across the globe as the framework for creating rules or regulatory regimes behind, because the framework today, in terms of the TCFD, is more up to interpretation. Things like the SEC's climate rule, as well as things like the CSRD in Europe, will require companies in a more uniform way to enable comparability amongst companies, obviously, to disclose these types of issues in terms of qualitative measures and how they manage climate risk within the organization.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I would say, in addition to that, these feel fairly aligned, not identical for sure, but fairly aligned with what the commission already requires in rules that have been in place, I think, for well over 10 years. Maybe not quite to the same threshold, but this feels just like a continuation of that. As we get ready to wrap up this first part of the conversation, Mark, I guess the perhaps $1 million question everybody's wondering is the timing of the required disclosures. So, any prediction that you have on this, if this gets adopted in April, as the SEC has suggested it will, when do you think the rules take effect?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think this is another area where we saw a lot of pushback and we saw organizations interested in having a little bit more of a runway. And I think just by having this extended period between the proposal and the final rule coming out, organizations have been afforded a little bit more of a runway, although there is a little bit of uncertainty, obviously, in terms of what they need to do. Those general kind of concepts as recommended by the TCFD are really good ways for organizations to get prepared in that manner. But as we look to potentially April, potentially further out, based on how the SEC typically operates, I would think by 2024 reporting periods we'll see requirements potentially, but that could be obviously pushed out to 2025 depending on how far into the current year we get before we see something final from the SEC.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you assume that this gets dropped in April, which is fairly analogous to when they issued the proposal in March last year, the proposal would have required companies to be using the 2023 reporting year. So if you kind of play that out in a final rule, that would be the 2024 reporting year, as you said. And I actually think the SEC doesn't give companies a lot of time to prepare in this regard. Part of kind of my thought on how this whole thing's come together is maybe you slim down some of those disclosure requirements a little bit, but then you don't give them much leeway in terms of the timing. The other thing, of course, is that obviously this doesn't factor in potential litigation or other scrutiny that might come. And so I think that's obviously something else that we need to keep in mind. Mark, thank you. No doubt, countless business leaders are having discussions just like these behind closed doors, trying to get ahead of what's to come. Really appreciate you coming in and sharing your insights with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So it's a careful balance. Right now, none of us for sure know what will be required of public companies in the short and long term, which begs the question, what can corporate executives be doing right now, despite the uncertainty, in order to prepare for a final ruling? Earlier this month, Workiva and PwC released a new report examining how businesses are preparing for the SEC's new climate disclosure rules. We surveyed 300 executives at US-based public companies with at least 500 million or more in annual revenue. And two statistics stood out to me. First, almost all leaders, 96%, say they will proceed with assurance regardless of whether it's a requirement of the final SEC rules. And second, 85% of business leaders say they are concerned their company does not have the right technology in place to support the level of reporting requirements in the proposed rules. So with that in mind, I'd like to reintroduce David Kanarek, Vice President and Managing Counsel at the American Express Company. Now, while our survey looked at aggregate responses, David's here to share with us how the management team at his organization is thinking about and preparing for the SEC's ruling. So, David, welcome to the show.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me.
So, David, it feels like we've been waiting for the ball to drop on New Year's Eve, only this time it's for the SEC's climate disclosure rules. As an advisor on SEC reporting at American Express, what's the temperature in the room when you're discussing the proposal, and what do you expect to see when the final ruling comes to light?
So I think you and Mark did a really great job at sort of laying the foundation and giving that crystal ball view. I also had an opportunity to listen to your ESG Talk podcast from February 10th. So a little shameless plug for that episode for those who haven't listened to it. But I thought you did a good job discussing the latest of the proposal at that point. So to recap, for the listeners, you had noted that the SEC received 14,000 comment letters, and the staff is sorting through them, building a case as to why the new requirements are necessary and legally defensible. So certainly a lot for the staff to work through. You've been talking about the Right Flex agenda and the April deadline, although remember that the last Right Flex agenda also said October 2022 for a final rule. So we'll see if they hold to that. So what happened since the February podcast, and where are we? And the only other thing I'd note is that we've had some more speeches by Chair Gensler talking about the importance of these disclosures and letters back and forth from congressional Republicans and Democrats. So we'll have to see.
Now, A moment ago, I talked a little bit about the recent study and survey by PwC and Workiva on this topic. 300 business leaders told us that their company's taken at least one action in pursuing, or excuse me, in anticipation of the rule becoming law, with many, of course, doing more than just one thing. The most common actions included making ESG investments in terms of talent and technology and accelerating or establishing climate goals. Does that hold true for American Express? What specific actions has your team taken to prepare?
Yeah, so I'm not surprised at all by that survey response. In addition to the SEC rule proposal, just even in the United States, you also have a proposed federal acquisition regulation that would require climate disclosures from approximately 5,700 significant and major federal contractors. There's a bill sitting in the California legislature uh, for climate disclosures that would apply to 5,400 companies that do business in California. And you had already mentioned the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which has already been adopted. The EU estimates that 50,000 entities will eventually be in scope for reporting, from EU legal entities to multinationals with significant EU presence. Uh, and of course, that's just on the regulation. There's also voluntary disclosures that companies are already making. 13,000 companies provide climate disclosures through CDP, and more than 4,000 companies at year end of 2022 are setting net zero targets or committing to do so through Science-Based Targets Initiative, which will in and of itself require reporting and measurement. So the direction of travel is certainly towards some sort of climate disclosure and management, whether it's regulation or voluntary. At American Express, we've been building out our corporate sustainability team, including new positions focused on operations. We've created a new ESG finance team within our controllership organization, and just continuing on the reporting journey. So, for example, we submitted near-term and long-term emissions reductions targets to SBTI for validation, and we're due to publish our first sustainability reporting, or our first sustainability financing report following our first sustainability bond issuance last year. All that experience helps our teams prepare for an eventual SEC rulemaking, as well as compliance with those international reporting regimes.
Well, it sounds like you're certainly taking this seriously and making significant efforts in this regard. David, our survey also showed that the majority of business leaders are planning to move ahead with assurance, regardless of whether or not it's a requirement of the final ruling. What do you think that is?
Yeah, Mark already mentioned that you're getting a lot of many companies are already getting some level of assurance, and I'm not surprised that companies would want that level of rigor around their processes. Um, the SEC actually quoted a Center for Audit Quality survey that they published that over half of companies in the S&P 500 have obtained some form of assurance, and that was just as of the 2020 sustainability reporting. And they also took it one step further and cited that 80% of S&P 100 companies subject certain items to their ESG information to assurance. So it is certainly, again, that where people are going.
Well, and as I look at that, I think about just how important I would say investor grade reporting is with respect to these. And certainly assurance is one way, a very big way, of course, to get to that level of reporting. David, before we end the show, we like to end each episode with a big takeaway for our audience. So I'm wondering, as we await the final ruling, what are some practical ways that management teams can encourage collaboration between their finance, auditing, risk, and sustainability teams? Much it sounds like in what you're doing at American Express to bring all these teams together.
That's exactly right. So what I would recommend is continue to information share within your organization. Start bringing in teams into sustainability reporting that may not have traditionally been there. You referenced a few, but finance, audit, and risk. And continue to enhance your control environment and start thinking about climate as a separate topic, whether it's for governance purposes, strategy, or risk management. So, for example, I'm sure many real estate teams would think about the operational risk associated with having a new office building or a plant located in a low-lying floodplain. That analysis could certainly be considered climate risk management, although probably was just embedded in decision making in the past. So think about that, even potential associated costs as sort of a separate category, and note that to your reporting teams so they have a head start when they begin to draft some of these disclosures for the SEC.
Well, certainly insightful and helpful, David. I really, really appreciate you coming by and sharing your insights with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience for joining us for this episode of ESG Talk, brought to you by Workiva, the world's only unified platform for financial reporting, ESG, audit, and risk. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a colleague, a friend, or someone who you think might find it useful. And please subscribe to see future episodes on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. Thanks again to Mandy McReynolds for sharing the mic with me, and thank you again to our audience for joining us.